By far the most popular video we have on our YouTube channel is actually not a video. It's an audio podcast about a certain feud that we posted long before we started making these actual videos. That shows you the attraction that two particular Appalachian families, the Hatfields and the McCoys, have on folks in this country. Today we're going to tell you another story about a Hatfield, cousin of Devil Anse, who came to Dickenson County, Virginia from Pike County, Kentucky, and got himself into a bit of trouble while he was there. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilly, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, A History of Appalachia.
So this guy claimed he was associated with, I guess, the famous feud. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah, he did. He claimed that he was associated with the Hatfield, said he was Devil Anse's cousin. He was about, I think, 70 years old at the time, so that would have made him, this was in the 20s, so that would have made him probably in his 30s when the feud was going on. So he could quite well have taken part in it, although, to be honest, he was a little bit old to be part of the main players of that, and there's nothing that I found that indicates that this guy, his name's John Hatfield, not Johnsy, that's Devil Anse's son, but a John Hatfield, was involved in the feud, although I'm not an expert on the Hatfields and McCoys, neither are you. So if somebody does know that and can kind of tie this guy in, let us know in the comments down below. We'd appreciate that.
Yep.
Now, a body was discovered floating in the McClure River near Steinman one Tuesday morning in the early fall of 1923. Now, Steinman is a community in southwest Virginia near the Kentucky border in Dickenson County. The man who found that body, a Mr. Dean, contacted the law, which sent out an officer, C.A. Long of Moss, to investigate. The deceased was soon identified as Irvin Mullins. Mr. Mullins had reportedly left his home on the previous Sunday, according to his wife. An examination of the area around the river where Mullins was found led Officer Long to the home of a man named Steve Woods.
Long spoke to Woods, who told him that Mr. Mullins had been to his house on Sunday morning, and he was searching for a hound puppy that had wandered away. Woods had not seen the dog, nor did he know where it was. He then told Mullins that he and a friend, a man named John Hatfield, were planning on doing a run of whiskey up on that hill that night and asked him if he wanted to join in. Well, Mullins thought about it and decided that, he'd like to partake in running that still end, and, we can assume, partaking in a bit of the stuff along the way, he agreed to join the two men. John Hatfield, by the way, was the 70-year-old cousin of the one and only Devil Anse Hatfield, and had participated in the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud.
Well, at least according to him.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the three men went to the still, where they stayed till about 9 o'clock that Sunday night. What happened next was disputed in court later, with three different versions of the story told to the judge and jury. Now, one story had it that Mullins did something that ruined the run that night, and in anger, Hatfield and Woods killed him, then dragged his body to a nearby cliff and threw his body into the McClure River down below. Another story involved Mrs. Mullins, who Irvin was convinced was having an affair with a man named Keenis Wright. Irvin had sworn out a warrant against Wright for adultery, as well as a warrant for assault by Wright against Mullins that happened when Irvin confronted the accused adulterer, and soon after, Irvin Mullins disappeared that Sunday night, and so did Keenis Wright. Yet another story was that Irvin got so drunk on moonshine that he left the still, wandered into the woods, and simply fell over that cliff by accident.
Well, the discovery of Irvin Mullins' body that Tuesday caused quite a stir in Dickenson County, resulting in the coroner being called in for an inquest. Dr. A.W. Martin was assigned to examine Mr. Mullins' body, which he did. He testified at that inquest that, in his opinion, Irvin Mullins had been dead for some time, and that whatever it was that killed him, it was not the river, since he had not found any water in the deceased man's lungs. He also went into a long list of the wounds suffered by the deceased, including a severe laceration above the left eye, a wound on the top of the head that penetrated the skull, a skull fracture, and dried blood on the left side of the face and around the left ear. The body's shoes contained dirt, but not the mouth, which indicated that Mullins had been dragged across the ground by the upper part of his body. Sounded like this guy knew what he was talking about. Well, in the end, it was Dr. Martin's opinion that the wound over the eye was sufficient to have caused the man's death. John Hatfield and Steve Woods were arrested and charged with the murder of Irvin Mullins.
Well, the two men were tried in Clintwood, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years and placed in the Dickenson County Jail pending transport to the Virginia Penitentiary. Soon thereafter, on December 12, 1923, they were transferred to the Wise County Jail. Now, it appears that their presence in the jail in Clintwood was not welcome, so it was decided to move them for quote-unquote safekeeping. Along with John Hatfield and Steve Woods, a man awaiting trial for criminal assault on a young girl named Edwards, and a man by the name of Alec Mullins, who was being held on a charge of murdering a man named Baker, were also moved. They, too, not welcome as guests at the Dickenson County Jail. These men, along with a young man named Carl Miller of Appalachia, who was being held on a liquor charge, were being housed on the 4th floor of the jail in Wise. When they arrived at their new home, the jailer booked them in and took them upstairs to their cells. Now, on the way up, John Hatfield engaged the jailer in conversation. As they got to the top of the stairs, Hatfield remarked to the jailer that there was no way they were going to be able to hold him in this jail since he was going to be breaking out real soon. Now, that comment brought a hearty laugh from the jailer, who smiled, looked at Hatfield, and replied,
"No, you ain't."
He soon came to regret those words.
Well, 2 days after they arrived at the Wise jail, the prisoners sawed a steel rail off one of the beds and used it to break the bars on the window to get out of their cell. Now, they then took a water hose and used it as a makeshift rope to climb down to the ground from the 4th floor and make a run for it. Down went the 5 prisoners, and floor after floor toward freedom. As John Hatfield passed the 1st floor on the Wise County Jail, the old man yelled out to the other prisoners still inside,
"Tell that jailer he told me a barefaced lie when he said there's no chance for me to get out of here."
Well, these men got down to the courtyard and then took off. And here's where God or nature or karma, whatever you want to call it, came into play for these escapees.
Yeah, it did, Rod, because not long before the jailbreak, it had started snowing in Wise. And when I say snowing, I mean snowing. It was coming down in buckets by the time they got to the ground outside. Within an hour, there was at least 2 inches of snow on the ground, with more and more falling by the minute. A posse was soon formed to search for the missing men, headed by Wise County Sheriff Auburn L.P. Corder. Hatfield, Woods, and the others were believed to be headed to Kentucky in this winter snowstorm. That snow, though, turned out to be no match for the sheriff, who managed to capture John Hatfield and 3 of the other men within 2 miles of Wise and place them in custody. Now, one newspaper report, I think it was the Bristol Courier, if I'm not mistaken, they reported at the time that Hatfield had fallen several feet from his makeshift rope and severely injured himself and had to be carried away from the jail by the others. And this might explain why Sheriff Corder managed to catch him so quickly. Now, Woods and Hatfield had filed an appeal of their conviction, which was heard by the Supreme Court of Appeals at Richmond. In that appeal, the men's court-appointed attorneys argued that their original indictment was defective for, among other reasons, failing to specifically identify the victim, Irvin Mullins, as a human being, as opposed to a rock or an animal or a tree or what have you. After 2 pages of opinion, the Supreme Court dismissed that argument, as they should. More importantly for the 2 defendants, the court did dismiss the case for insufficient evidence to convict them of the murder of Irvin Mullins.
We're not sure whatever happened to Mr. Woods or Mr. Hatfield, although we did locate a post from a descendant of Irvin Mullins in which it was thought that John Hatfield and Steve Woods were administered a bit of, Well, that good old mountain justice by Irvin Mullins' kin after that case was overturned. Well, if they were, there were no news reports about it, and I'm sure there weren't, Steve, because that was something that was best settled in the quiet hills of the mountains.
Well, that would explain why nobody ever heard of John Hatfield, not to mention Mr.
Right.
Woods, ever again.
Wow. The thing that gets me, too, is the fact of the case specifically identifying the victim as a human being. I mean, what were they going to identify him as? I mean, opposed to that's something like you'd hear in today's courtroom. Let's be specific about this. What are we talking about here? So that's kind of a bold stunt for these guys.
You've heard the term snatching at straws?
Yes.
That's what that was. That attorney did not have a whole lot to argue. So he was throwing everything but the kitchen sink and the kitchen sink in, too, to boot.
And probably during this time, the outhouse as well, too. So we could include that in there as well.
Oh, goodness. Well, folks, that's the story of the time a Hatfield escaped from the Wise County Jail. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now, be sure to go down below. Click that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Ding the bell so you'll get notified whenever we come out with a new story. And if you like what you heard today, please give us a thumbs up too. So long, everybody.
So long.